I'm nobody's definition of a liberal. I don't really like them that much, but the way that conservatives think of women is very mistaken in two distinct ways. First mistake in how conservatives think of women is how they think of women in the past. When conservatives think of women in the past, they think of mainly how upper class women in the past lived. They think of women who were very in their feminine role, which, okay, women in the past were a lot more attuned to, the role of being a caretaker and whatnot, but along with other things, we'll get into that. But they will see older women as being more feminine, refined, less butch than modern women. And this is just really not the case. Now, it makes sense that conservatives would think of women in the past as being like that, because that's how women from the social class that was writing things down, and thus we have more surviving historical records of, lived their lives. Throughout the incredibly vast majority of human history, the incredibly vast majority of people who could read and write were in the much upper classes. 2,000 years ago, almost nobody could read or write, and almost all of those people were quite rich. People were quite rich, the women, they had servants to do things for them. They didn't really work that hard. They didn't have to, deal with marauding pillagers or whatever, because they just had their own armies, basically, to fight them. They could afford to live that kind of life, where they were just women, just dainty, frolicking maidens. The incredibly vast majority of women throughout human history who did not write down their experiences, but accounts of them were definitely written down. And we know how most people lived their lives throughout most of human history. They did not have any of those kinds of luxuries. Life was hard. Life was very, very rough in ways that most modern women and most modern men really, I recommend you research it, go ChatGPT it up, but people just don't have that much of a grasp of just how hard just staying alive was throughout human history. Nobody could be feminine. There was no opportunity to be soft and emotional and this and that. You had to be rough and ready if you were going to survive, and even then you probably wouldn't live that long. A good example of something that we might have more historical accounts of would be American settler women. Granted, they weren't like sword-swinging warriors going out hunting bears. They weren't exactly the same as men. They weren't as manly as their husbands were. That's true. Of course, there's division of roles. There's going to be division of personalities, how people are being raised. They're not going to be exactly the same. So now I've gotten that out of the way, people are still going to be blowing up my comment section saying, "What, you're saying they were exactly like men? Well, blah, blah, blah." No, they weren't. Okay, relax. But the settler women, they were not arriving here and then they were just frolicking through the American fields. No, they were starving unless they worked. And women back in those days, throughout most of human history, they worked with their hands. They did farm work. They slaughtered animals. They were not just raising the kids and cooking meals and making sourdough all day long. The second way in which the way that conservatives these days think about women is mistaken is how they think about modern women. They think of modern women as being more masculine than their also mistaken perception of older women. And this is very, very far from the case. A modern woman would get her ass whooped, just absolutely knocked down, dragged out by a settler woman. Modern women are a lot more emotional, a lot girlier, just like modern men are, for the same reason that modern men are more feminine, because we live in a time that allows it. You can be feminine these days and be alive. Could you imagine a settler woman, or some woman in the Middle East 2,000 years ago, any woman from any time period that the vast majority of human history, could you imagine that woman crying because of something she saw that Trump said online, or somebody misgendered her at her workplace, or this or that? Could you imagine a settler woman crying over the things that modern women will cry in public on camera over? Neither could I. While it's true that women are in the workforce and fulfilling what the man's role is, going out and earning the bread, that role has completely changed to the point where you don't really need to be tough and manly to do it anymore. You're not going out and hunting bears, fighting rival tribes or anything like that. You work in an office. That does not make you hyper masculine. Boss babes, they're not particularly masculine people. They just work in an office. I think at the end of the day, so many of the problems that come from men not being masculine enough is just matched by women these days, except to a much greater extent, because women now are quite dramatic. All the things that guys complain about when they say, "I don't really even want to date anymore." They blow up. they'll ghost you, they'll play all these games, and they're unstable, and they're this and they're that. Like, all these modern women hysterics, it comes in part from the fact that there's no outside, there's Mongols coming, we're starving, this and that. There's no outside stressors that are forcing them to toughen up. Same with men. That's why you also have men, you have performative males these days, like guys addicted to porn, stuff like that, because there's nothing forcing them to be better than that, and it affects these women's beliefs as well. Could you imagine a settler woman, you come up to her and you explain to her how actually there's 587 genders, and we need abortion on demand, and this and that, blah, 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 blah. No, she'd smack you and tell you to stop whining and get to work because there's farm work that needs to be done. Like, they would not fall for any of this crap, same as their husbands wouldn't. It's exactly the kind of emotional self-centeredness that's necessary for virtue-signaling liberals to exist. I agree that we in the West should return to our traditional roots and that men should become manlier, and I amend that by not saying that women should become more womanly, but saying that women should become manlier as well.